Hey there, and welcome to a deep dive into a topic you might not have heard of, but one that's had a surprising influence.
Yeah.
The Pioneer Fund. We're going to be using an in-depth law review article by Paul Lombardo as our guide.
Yeah,
And trust me, it's a wild ride.
it really is. The Pioneer Fund has been around for decades, quietly funding research on some pretty sensitive topics,
Right.
like race intelligence and genetics.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. You'll see how this organization, founded on the principles of eugenics,
Yeah.
has shaped the conversation around these issues even today. It's a chance to sharpen your critical thinking skills and see how scientific research can sometimes get tangled up
For sure.
with social and political agendas.
Exactly. We need to understand the context behind the research, who's funding it, and what their motivations might be.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with eugenics itself. You might be thinking, eugenics, isn't that a thing of the past? But you'd be surprised how much its legacy lives on in subtle ways. Basically, eugenics is the idea that you can control reproduction to create a better population.
Right.
Kind of like selective breeding, but for humans.
And in the early 20th century, eugenics wasn't some fringe idea. It was embraced by scientists, politicians, and even popular culture.
Wow.
It was seen as a way to solve social problems, a path to a better society.
Lombardo introduces us to some of the key figures in the American eugenics movement:
Okay.
Harry Laughlin, Madison Grant, and Charles Davenport. Now, these guys were obsessed with the idea of a superior Nordic race, and they were very influential.
They weren't just theorists either. They actively pushed for policies reflecting their beliefs. Laughlin, for example, developed a model sterilization law,
Oh, wow.
allowing for the forced sterilization of people deemed unfit to reproduce.
And it's chilling to realize forced sterilizations continued in the U.S. well into the 20th century.
Yeah.
That's a direct result of these ideas being put into practice.
It really makes you question how seemingly scientific ideas can be twisted to serve harmful agendas.
Absolutely.
And this leads us right to the Pioneer Fund. When we consider its mission of race betterment,
Right.
can you see a potential through line from those early eugenic ideas to the Pioneer Fund's agenda?
Oh, absolutely. And that line gets even bolder when we meet Wycliffe Draper, the man who bankrolled the Pioneer Fund.
Yeah.
He was a wealthy textile magnate, but also a hardcore believer in eugenics.
Draper was so committed to these ideas that he not only funded essay contests promoting eugenics research,
Wow.
but he even attended a Nazi eugenics conference in Berlin in 1935.
Wow, attending a Nazi eugenics conference in 1935, that's not something you hear every day.
It really highlights how these ideas, which we might consider fringe today,
Yeah.
were being taken seriously by some in positions of power.
Right.
And this brings us to the birth of the Pioneer Fund. Draper, along with Harry Laughlin, founded the organization in 1937.
Okay.
The charter specifically aimed at supporting research on race betterment.
One of their first big projects was a study exploring whether you could encourage families of superior Army Air Corps pilots to have more children by offering financial incentives. It seems almost comical now, like they were trying to breed a master race of aviators.
What's interesting is that they found financial incentives alone didn't actually increase birth rates significantly.
Huh.
This subtly challenges the simplicity of the eugenic agenda, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even back then, the complexities of human behavior defied their attempts at manipulation.
So the Pioneer Fund is established. Its first major project kind of backfires in a way.
Right.
But how does it adapt and continue after World War II when eugenics, at least publicly, starts to lose favor?
That's where things get even more complex.
Okay.
After the horrors of the Holocaust, eugenics became a taboo subject. So figures like Frederick Osborne,
Okay.
a prominent eugenicist who had joined the Pioneer Fund,
Right.
tried to distance the movement from its explicitly racist past.
But Osborne's actions are interesting because while he criticized some aspects of eugenics, he continued to support other forms of it, like what he called negative eugenics, the idea of discouraging reproduction among those deemed undesirable.
Yeah.
And importantly, he remained connected to Draper and the Pioneer Fund. It's a bit like trying to have your cake and eat it too, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to distance yourself from the most extreme elements of a belief system
Yeah.
while still holding on to some of its core tenets.
It really shows how deeply ingrained some of these beliefs were,
Right.
even among those who saw themselves as reformers.
And of course, the Pioneer Fund, under Draper's guidance, kept funding research that fit his vision.
That included support for people like Stanley Burnham, who wrote a book arguing for inherent racial differences in intelligence
Wow.
and advocating for policies like sterilizing welfare recipients.
It's shocking to think that someone could advocate for something like that.
It is.
But it shows how these ideas, even after the horrors of World War II, were still circulating and finding support.
It's a stark reminder of how seemingly scientific ideas can be used to justify truly harmful actions. It's disturbing, no doubt. But, it's also a reminder that we can't just dismiss these ideas as fringe or irrelevant. We have to understand them if we want to challenge them effectively. And the Pioneer Fund's story goes even deeper. Lombardo reveals their connection to something you might not expect, the Back to Africa movement.
Wait, the Back to Africa movement, how does that fit into the Pioneer Fund's agenda?
Well, this movement, while seemingly separate from genetics research, was actually intertwined with Wycliffe Draper's vision. He was a big supporter of Ernest Sevier Cox, a writer and activist who devoted his life to promoting the idea of sending Black Americans back to Africa.
Wow, I had no idea. So Draper's vision wasn't just about funding scientific research, it was about actively shaping racial demographics in America.
Exactly. And it wasn't just talk either. Draper put his money where his mouth was. He funded the printing and distribution of Cox's book, White America, which advocated for repatriation. He even lobbied Congress to support these efforts.
It's alarming to think this was happening alongside the Pioneer Fund's supposedly scientific research. It really highlights how Draper saw racial purity and scientific inquiry as two sides of the same coin.
And consider the political climate of the time. Cox and Draper weren't working in a vacuum. They found allies in powerful figures like Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi, an outspoken white supremacist, and a vocal supporter of repatriation.
It's a chilling reminder that these ideas, which we would now rightly condemn, were once mainstream political positions. It makes you realize how much progress we've made, but also how much work there's still left to do.
Absolutely. And this movement, while losing steam after World War II, continued to simmer beneath the surface, fueled by the ongoing support of people like Draper.
So we've got this web of interconnected ideas and figures, from eugenics to the Pioneer Fund to the Back to Africa movement. It's all pretty unsettling. But it's important to remember that these weren't the only perspectives on race and genetics at the time, right?
Of course not. There were other voices, often marginalized, who challenged these ideas. And even within the eugenics movement itself, there were those who tried to reform it to strip away the most egregious elements of racism and coercion.
Lombardo focuses on Frederick Osborne, one of the Pioneer Fund's founding board members, as an example of this internal struggle. He was a eugenicist, but he also tried to distance himself from the overt racism of people like Laughlin and Draper.
Osborne's a fascinating case study. He criticized the work of the Eugenics Record Office, led by Harry Laughlin, calling it thoroughly unscientific. He saw himself as pushing eugenics towards a more scientific and less overtly racist path.
But at the same time, he continued to work with Draper and the Pioneer Fund, even when they were funding research aligned with racist ideas. And he still supported the idea of negative eugenics, discouraging reproduction among those deemed undesirable. It's a real contradiction, isn't it?
It is. And it highlights how difficult it can be to disentangle oneself from deeply ingrained beliefs, even when we recognize some of their harmful aspects.
It's a cautionary tale for all of us, reminding us to constantly examine our own beliefs and to be willing to challenge them even when it's uncomfortable.
Couldn't agree more. And this brings us to the Pioneer Fund's evolution in the post-war world. As we move into the latter half of the 20th century, they continue operating, but more discreetly, shifting their focus from overt calls for racial segregation to funding research exploring, or at least claiming to explore, the genetic basis for racial differences.
Lombardo provides several examples of this. There's Stanley Burnham, who wrote a book arguing that Black Americans had lower intelligence than white Americans due to genetic factors.
And Burnham didn't stop at simply presenting this theory. He went on to advocate for policies reflecting this supposed intelligence gap, even suggesting things like sterilizing welfare recipients.
It's like those old eugenic ideas repackaged for new era. And then there's J. Philip Rushton, another Pioneer Fund grantee who got a lot of attention and criticism for his research on racial differences in intelligence criminality and even sexual behavior.
Rushton's work was widely criticized for its methodology, with many scientists arguing it was flawed and biased.
Yet the Pioneer Fund continued to support his work. That's a big red flag, isn't it? It suggests they weren't necessarily interested in objective science, but rather in finding evidence to support a pre-existing worldview.
Exactly. And it shows how the Pioneer Fund, through its funding choices, could amplify these ideas and lend them a veneer of scientific legitimacy.
And then there's Richard Lynn, another Pioneer Fund grantee. He's written extensively on the topic of dysgenics, the idea that modern society is experiencing genetic decline because it allows the unfit to reproduce. Have you ever heard someone say that society is going downhill because those people are having too many kids? Well, that idea has roots in this concept of dysgenics.
It's a frightening thought, isn't it? That idea of genetic decline being used to justify discrimination and control over who gets to reproduce. And like Rushton's work, Lynn's research has been criticized for its lack of scientific rigor, relying on outdated and unreliable data.
But again, the Pioneer Fund continued to support his work, providing a platform for these ideas to gain traction. These examples, while disturbing, are just a glimpse into the Pioneer Fund's influence. It extends far beyond these individuals, shaping the landscape of research on race and genetics in subtle but significant ways.
And it's not just about the research itself, it's about the broader social and political implications. This research, even if flawed, can be used to justify discriminatory policies and reinforce existing inequalities.
It's a stark reminder that we can't separate science from its social and political context. We need to be aware of the power dynamics at play, the motivations of those funding the research, and the potential consequences, both intended and unintended.
It's about asking critical questions. Who benefits from this research? Whose voices are being silenced? And how might this research be used to harm or marginalize certain groups? We need to be vigilant, especially when research touches on sensitive topics like race and genetics.
Absolutely. And speaking of the Pioneer Fund's impact, they've even been linked to funding researchers who contributed to The Bell Curve, that incredibly controversial book that reignited the debate about race and intelligence in the 1990s.
Ah, yes, the bell curve. That was a real watershed moment, bringing these ideas, which had been simmering beneath the surface, into the mainstream public discourse. And the Pioneer Fund, through its decades of funding research aligned with these ideas, played a key role in shaping the landscape for that book's reception.
It's a reminder that scientific research, even if flawed, can have a profound impact on public perception and policy decisions.
Precisely. And it brings us to the Pioneer Fund's present-day activities. They're still operating today, still funding research, and still shaping the conversation, even if it's not always as overt as it once was.
So even though we might not hear their name as often, their influence persists. It's a bit like an undercurrent shaping the direction of the conversation without always being visible on the surface.
Exactly. And one of the ways they've managed to maintain their influence is through a carefully crafted strategy of deflecting criticism and defending their legacy.
Right. Lombardo mentions how they've repeatedly denied accusations of racism, often accusing their critics of McCarthyism, in an attempt to silence them.
And they've also tried to distance themselves from those early connections to the Nazi eugenics movement, claiming their founders' views were just a product of their time.
It's a classic tactic, right? Minimize, deny, and deflect. But as we've seen, the historical record paints a pretty clear picture of their agenda.
It does indeed. And it's a reminder that we need to be skeptical of these kinds of denials, especially when they come from organizations with a vested interest in controlling the narrative.
So what does this all mean for us? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the Pioneer Fund's history and influence? What do you think?
Well, for me, I think it's a powerful reminder that we can't just take research at face value, especially when it touches on sensitive topics like race and genetics. We need to understand, who's funding it, what their motivations might be, and how that might influence the research itself. It's about cultivating that healthy skepticism.
I think that's a crucial point. It's about developing a critical lens. Being aware of the historical context and understanding that science is never truly neutral. It's always embedded in a social and political context shaped by the values and biases of those who conduct and fund it.
And that leads to another important takeaway, recognizing that seemingly objective research can be used to advance particular agendas that might not align with our own values. The Pioneer Fund story is a perfect example of this. It's a cautionary tale, reminding us to be vigilant, to question assumptions, and to demand transparency from those claiming to speak in the name of science. We need to be aware of the power dynamics at play and ask ourselves, who benefits from this research? Whose voices are being marginalized? How might this research be used to reinforce existing inequalities?
It's a lot to consider, but these are important questions to ask if we want to create a more just and equitable society. And Lombardo doesn't just leave us with warnings. He ends his article with a thought-provoking challenge. He asks us to imagine that we could design a research fund today, one focused on improving society. What ethical guidelines would we put in place to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past?
It's a big question, isn't it? It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about the potential for bias in scientific research, and to think critically about how to safeguard against it. So if you were designing this hypothetical research fund, what would be your top priorities?
For me, transparency would be key. Full disclosure of funding sources, potential conflicts of interest, even the research questions being asked. No more hiding behind vague agendas. Everything out in the open.
I love that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I'd add a strong emphasis on diverse perspectives, not just in terms of the researchers being funded, but also in the communities being studied. We need to ensure the research is inclusive and representative of the full spectrum of human experiences.
Right. No more cherry-picking data to fit a pre-existing narrative,
Yep.
and maybe even a requirement for community engagement, where the research questions are shaped collaboratively with the people who will be most impacted by the findings.
That's a great idea. It shifts the power dynamics and ensures that those who have historically been marginalized and exploited by research have a say in how that research is conducted.
And of course, rigorous ethical review is a must. Independent boards with diverse expertise, not just scientists, but also ethicists, social scientists, and community representatives who can carefully scrutinize research proposals and make sure they meet the highest ethical standards.
It sounds like we're designing a research fund that's more accountable, more transparent, and more responsive to the needs of the communities. It's supposed to serve a far cry from the Pioneer Fund and its legacy.
Definitely. And it's a reminder that we don't have to accept the status quo. We can envision a better future for scientific research, one where knowledge is used to promote justice and equity, not to reinforce systems of oppression.
And that vision starts with each of us. It starts with recognizing our own biases, challenging the status quo, and using our voices to advocate for a more just and equitable world. So listeners, as you continue to explore these issues, ask yourself, what guidelines would you put in place? How can we collectively work towards a more ethical and just research landscape?
Because recognizing the influence of organizations like the Pioneer Fund empowers us to be more discerning consumers of scientific information. It helps us see those hidden agendas, the potential consequences, and make informed decisions about what research we trust and support.
Remember, science is a human endeavor shaped by human values and subject to human fallibility. We must remain vigilant, question assumptions, and demand transparency.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a journey, but hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of the Pioneer Fund, its legacy, and the importance of critical thinking when it comes to scientific research.